Service Lab is a community of service design doers and the service design curious. We meet up every few months to share our learnings with each other.
To start with, we would like to have all the speakers kind of introducing themselves. I'm not putting them on the spot, they already know that this is coming. So it would be great if, Adi, if you don't mind starting, just telling a little bit about yourself and perhaps what you do and whatever you want to share.
Sure, thanks. Firstly, thanks so much for having me. I've been looking forward to this panel and hearing, having a good discussion and hearing other people's thoughts. My name's Adewunmi. I lead advising and strategy with Cloudera Fast Forward Labs. That's a part of Cloudera, which is a data storage company that's focused on machine learning. So in my day job, I support organizations as they try and make good use of their data and think about the use of that data specifically in the area of machine learning, but also more broadly, and what that means once machine learning models are integrated into applications that then face out into the real world, what that looks like. Before working with Cloudera, I worked in other consulting roles. And before that, I worked within the UK government in the government digital service, again, focusing on data. Oh, I should say, as a result of these roles, I worked a lot with service designers, and I'm especially interested in user-centered design.
That's great. Thank you for sharing. Mario?
Yeah, hi everyone. I'm Pernia. I'm a Venezuelan living in Milan, Italy since 8 years ago. And I'm a strategic and service designer working for a business consultancy called OpenKnowledge, that is part of the business integration partners here in Italy. And yes, I'm a consultant, so you know what we really do working for the private sector. But the most interesting part of my profile is that I also co-host some events of service design drinks here in Milan. And also due to this sort of community and place of contaminations, many things are happening, and I'm involved in three different kind of research. The first one is a research that is called Transforming Designers, that is studying the evolution of the role of the designer. So this is probably why I'm here today. And the other two are more related into understanding human behavior. So I'm a little bit obsessed with Gen Zeta, okay? And I'm analyzing how Gen Zeta is going to impact the way organizations are answering, even for the consumer or even for their employees. And the third one is like a little bit of spontaneous study that was born during the pandemic. So I'm studying how we as humans are evolving due to COVID-19. So we established also a research that is based in interviews from people coming from different parts of the world. And we're trying to, we're trying to imagine possible futures out of it. And yeah, this is me. I'm a little bit obsessed with how we're evolving in many ways. And this is the interesting part. Thank you.
That's great. Another interesting, different perspective. George?
My name is George A. I am the co-founder and director of innovation at Greater Good Studio. We have been based and working exclusively working in the social sector. So our clients are all nonprofits, foundations, and government. And for the last 9 years, we've been very fortunate, I think, in meeting really remarkable clients who are interested in sharing their power. And what that means for a lot of cases is that they see some inextricable social issue that they work on and are willing to admit that perhaps part of the reason why things are so screwed up is that there's been a lot of concentration of power in certain pockets. So the work that we do, and in particular, this practice of human-centered design, I carried over from my work as a designer at Audio for many years. I feel like I'm in a place right now where I'm having lots of conversations like this, so thank you for having me here, in doing a lot of unlearning and a lot of deprogramming, and very interested in working out how to lead conversations around design work that shows a different kind of maturation, because I feel like there's been a real question around who exactly are the humans that we center on when we think about human-centered design. And I think for a lot of my previous work, I never thought to ask that question. So now I'm in a place where I'm really interested in asking that and trying to see how much of this can be thought differently. So I'm so excited to have this conversation with everyone, and we have big professional crushes on all the folks on this call. So I'm really keen to get to know everyone. Thanks for having me.
Great, thank you, George, for being here. You can already start to see some of the questions, some of the topics that we're going to explore and the different perspectives. Kat?
Hi, folks. I'll echo that sentiment. George, really looking forward to the conversation today and really delighted to be here. So my name is Kat Macaulay. I'm the Chief Design Officer at Scottish Government. I lead a community of around over 100 designers in the core of Scottish Government, and responsible for supporting a huge range of public service design projects, from quite narrow niche specific things right up to Scottish Government has been designing a social security agency for the country, because we've just acquired or recently acquired the devolved power to administer quite a range of social security benefits. And I'm particularly interested in the conversation because I spend a lot of my time working at the intersection of policy and service implementation around big social problems, and spend a lot of my time trying to understand how to get the balance. I think, George, I would echo your points there. How to unlearn some of the things that I've learned in sort of 25 years of working around design and technology, in particular in design and service. How to think about how we rethink the role of the designer in the solving of those big wicked problems, and particularly how we bring design and some of the ideas and philosophies of design to a much wider audience, and how we empower citizens to be much more involved in designing the services that they need and designing policy for that matter as well. Thanks.
Great. That was also like a perfect conclusion, since we are now leading to the first topic that is actually about looking back. So we're going to go in this journey about looking back, looking at this power dynamics, about these unlearning, relearning, and this kind of like who are the users that we're talking about, and what are our role as well, and what it will be the future. So we're going to try to bring you in this journey, and I will start with this first question from my side. So I'm a service designer as well. I work for a company called Humanly, which is designed for social impact. And just to kind of like start with these reflections, and also cut what you were saying, so perhaps if you feel like starting on this, we would like to kind of ask you what's your reflections over how far we have come in design within the past decade. What are kind of like general reflections on that?
Yeah, sure. I mean, so it's funny, I was casting my mind back thinking, what was I doing 10 years ago? And I think one of the things I was doing around that time was examining one of the first PhDs in service design over in Sweden. And, if I think back to the understanding of the role and value of design in solving wider, more complex social challenges and problems, I think back then we were still in the era of, designers are very special people who have some sort of magic capacity to solve other people's problems for them. And I think certainly my own journey and the journey that I've had, particularly since joining government a number of years ago, has been around the understanding of the real value of design. For me, the real value of design is not designers doing designerly things. It's some of those really foundational philosophical ideas in design around how difficult it is for people to understand anyone else's problem, how difficult it is for human beings to solve problems. And actually, if you're very attentive to some of the core craft skills of design, you really start to learn that design is a very powerful tool set for anyone to help us all understand why, frankly, we're all really quite crap at solving problems. And design has tools that allow us to get better at that and do that collectively. So I think, and actually, I'm old enough to go back well beyond a decade. And if I think back to my very earliest involvements in design, particularly in technology in the sort of mid-90s, at that point, we were just beginning the journey away from thinking that human beings were a bit like machines and you designed as if a human being was a machine. That was the very beginning of the growth of ethnography and social science in the design world, particularly in technology. And so that journey almost feels like it's coming to another level now for me.
That's great. it's good to get your perspective about your journey as well. Some really powerful quotes on how powerful actually design is and how we're all capable of solving problems. So that's great. Is there anyone that wants to add something to it, or that disagree perhaps, or a different experience from the panel?
Yeah, if I can jump in.
Please.
I think, yeah, we have been living a quite important transformation in the last decade. I think to begin, we have been, working, we're expanded into new context. Okay, so we went out from the design studio and we started working within companies, within governments, within startups, and a lot of things. And within this new reality that we're living, that there are things that are, being changed in the way that we act design. Okay, the first thing is that I think that the design is not more related just for a product or a service. Right now, design is undertaking as a skill or a capability that is bringing a strategic point of view, okay, into organizations or wherever we're working. And I think this is quite important for where we're living. So we are expanding in new contexts in this way. We were used to say that we were designing services and we were designing products and so on. But also one of the changes that we are seeing right now is the fact that we are not only designing products and services as we used to, we're now probably also designing interconnected systems. So when Kat was saying about technology, we are like, being more familiar, being more close, because all the things that we are designing right now is not the touch point, the digital touch point or the app. It's the technology that is becoming a little bit fluid, like water, in the experiences that we are delivering. So we need to, learn about all the things. And also talking about the strategic part is one of the things that I have seen of the changes that we have been living is that we were like declared as the creative one. Like we are the creative, that we need time, we need inspiration, we need a lot of things, okay, to produce something, to design something. Right now, I think I found myself in the first hand, but what the research that we're doing is that we're finding that designers don't have any too much time to be creative right now. Okay, we don't have that time to gather some very big inspirations. Okay, because the context that we're living in is required for organizations to act, to fail, to innovate in a very fast way. But what happens with creativity in that sense? I think it's evolving in a sort of sense that we're calling making sense. So we're being dot connectors within organizations. We're being like enablers of conversations, or connecting different capabilities, different stakeholders, or different kind of narrative to put it together and try to create an outcome out of it. So I think we are living a very important transformation right now in this sense. But at the same time, one of the things that I think it remains as a design mantra or a design mindset from us is, even though that our approach or our creativity is being reduced due to timing and budgets and all the things, the complexities that we're dealing right now, I think one of the key aspects that design is still relevant today is because in our DNA as designers, we have the focus on the human needs or the human behaviors, and the part of the bringing also the human in our everyday practice, even if we're making sense, even if we're making a strategic framework for a company, even if we're doing an interconnected system, this is what makes the difference in the context that today. So this is more or less my vision.
That's great. I can see lots of new points and new aspects and new perspectives, from the whole creativity to the making sense and solving problems and the strategic side. Is there anything that Adi or George would like to add, or any particular reflection as well from your side?
I think the other, both Kat and Marianne have touched on, have answered that question so fully. The only thing I was going to add, in the last 10 years, so within that period, I was working in government, and one of the things that I definitely saw as a a change over the last decade has been thinking about who deserves ease and beauty in the services or products that they use. So I can remember earlier in my time in working in government, there was an acceptance, I think, almost that interacting with government was always going to be a grudge transaction, right? It was never something that needed to be easy, and no one had that expectation. And when you think about how wide government's reaches, looking back, that was an atrocious status quo, and that the idea that we accepted it for so long is really worrisome. I think in the latter parts of the past decade, the thing that I've seen that I'm most excited about, and I say this as someone who works in machine learning, is designers starting to grapple with what design looks like in a world where machine learning enabled applications are a real thing. What does this mean in terms of the user experience? What does it mean in terms of transparency? What does it mean in terms of power? And that's really exciting. And I think I would have loved, and I think the trajectory we've been on within machine learning would have been different and hopefully better if service design had been a discipline that had been engaging with this far earlier.
Yeah, it's going to be hard to add to anything that hasn't already been said so eloquently before, but maybe taking a different perspective. I might mention that I saw for a long period of time coming up in my career, design constantly complaining about it not having a seat at the table. And in doing so was constantly saying, when are we going to have our due respect? Harping on about it for bloody years. And I think we are there. I think it's definitely there. So much so, I think, in fact, that design is now showing up at tables they don't think they've realized have already been set for. And what I notice in the work that we do, where we're working with a lot of nonprofit or charity or sort of foundation and government clients, designers showing up willy-nilly with all the same chip on the shoulder about not getting respect and the similar urgency to crush everything that they're trying to do, like they're trying to make more work for Instagram, without realizing the complexity of the social sector and the complexity of how historically, where power has been such a key role in causing large social systemic issues. You can't treat this project in the same way you are going to treat the design of a new mobile app for Starbucks. Like in the same urgency of wanting to produce a product that can have great KPIs, I don't know which KPIs necessarily would matter when you're talking about distributing social services or trying to work out what are the needs of a single parent trying to get their kids to go to bed. There are so much complexity in history. We tend to obliterate that when we are working against a Gantt chart in the way we do our typical projects. So to see wholesale copy paste of design processes, and I say this with a lot of horrific insight because we did this, copy paste willy-nilly what we did from the commercial sector into the social sector without any adaptation is, I think, the de facto norm. And I think what was horrifying for us was we thought, what's the problem? Isn't this exactly what we should do? And I think for several years we thought, well, what's the big deal? And then we realized, oh, wait a second, we might be missing out on a number of different voices and in fact oversimplifying the complexity of these problems. So in these last 10 years, we've seen a lot of migration of designers, either because they're trying to pay down some karmic debt that they feel when we're having to work with a bunch of banks, or it's because they've actually legitimately found themselves working with nonprofit clients in a way that is, sustainable and repeatable. But I think there's still a lot of carryover from the rules and the spirit of working in a commercial sector that hasn't really been recognized when you migrate to the commercial sector, which I think is definitely a growing trend over the last 10 years.
That's great. I think you added lots of elements there, even though you started saying there is not much to add. There are like other elements that you brought up that I think they're kind of like giving a really good overview, like from the four of you, from all the kind of learnings that's being generated, as well as like the shift that we're kind of experiencing at the moment, and how it touched all the different like sectors in different ways. So it's exciting to shift also this conversation on what we've been reflecting to. Yeah, please do add.
There's one other thing, because I feel like I'm a bit of an outsider, because I didn't really know if I knew this world until I got invited to speak at a conference in Madrid, Barcelona. I think it was like a global service design conference. And I noticed like, oh, wow, there's a lot of banks here. There's a lot of bank representation. Like, we got that bit. And I don't think I realized what a big deal that was. And then secondarily, how huge these organizations have become over the last 10 years. So if there's one trend, because I've certainly seen it in the innovation space that I'm more familiar, is that the small organizations getting bought out, and ending up in the hands of ever increasingly large organizations themselves, giant pools of money, or represent giant pools of money, seem to be something that I hadn't kind of tracked. I don't know if others have noticed, or if I'm just like coming to this very late, but the chances of having small independent studios seems rarer these days. It seems like more likely you're going to be part of a giant thing, as opposed to have the autonomy and perhaps the inspiration to do something differently. I don't know if that seems obvious or heresy. I can't tell.
Yeah, I'd really echo that, George, and I think it is a real challenge. And certainly, I spent a good part of my career also as a design educator, and it worries me that trend is one of the things that's hampering the maturing of service design beyond its kind of initial roots, and also driving some of the kind of behaviours we've already mentioned that are not always helpful. And I think especially in the kind of spaces that you're working in, and are very similar to the spaces I work in, when you are trying to solve large, complex, systemic problems with a tool set derived from, designing products in the financial sector, or, building an app to book a ticket for the theatre, you will have a problem. But also, I think much more powerfully, and it's perhaps, also goes back to design education, there's a real challenge with the discomfort, that sense of aggrieved, not at the table, kind of somewhat petulant tone that we can sometimes take, really gets in the way of beginning to look beyond what is it that we bring to the group of people who will design a service, because a service designer never designs a service. And how will we operate in that environment? And also, what other skills do others have? I mean, a bit like you, George, I'm really mindful of the huge range of other approaches to solving large, complex problems that have a great history, and we have much to learn from. And we tend to avoid that. And I think that sort of, shrinking of the gene pool of small agencies who can be creative and innovative and fleet of foot, that is a real challenge for the community. And I do hope that we can continue to support our small and medium-sized agencies. And it's certainly something in Scottish Government that we really try hard to be thoughtful and mindful about how to support our smaller design agencies.
Yeah, I was not sure if Adewunmi wanted to add anything there, but there's definitely it was interesting to see also the kind of how you added on to the whole industry, different sectors and different situations as well, and how this is all evolving and changing. I just want also to kind of quickly say that also some conversation happening in the chat, and I can see you're already answering, and that's great. So this will help us also to kind of have multiple conversation going on parallel. I'm sure they have something to add. We can just moving on to the kind of next questions, and they kind of going smoothly, since I can see that you're already talking about power of future and other elements. So hopefully these will not break the flow, but will add some to it. I'm gonna pass it on to Sophie.
Just to shout out to some of the questions that have come up. Emma Rudd, you've got a great question. I think in a couple of topics time, I'll make sure I've made a note and we'll come back to it. But I do think there's a great question around some of the unlearnings. So I don't know if we could quickly go around and everyone just give us one of your top unlearnings that you've been going through recently or over the last kind of decade before we move on to the next one.
Happy to have a bash at that. So I think one of the I'm not sure it's necessarily an unlearning, because I had a long career before I joined the world of design, and I did know this in my previous careers. But I think one of the biggest things that I've really been sort of mindful of my own failings around is the willingness to pass the knowledge and the power of design to a much wider group of people, and to be less protective of my own sort of professional space in a room. And that's been a really exciting part of working in government and working around some really quite big, complex social challenges.
I think for me, learning that efficiency is not the only criteria. So I think in so many, and this kind of feeds into the conversation, the last discussion around the last question, that very often, and I don't think this is unique to service designers, we adapt to the organizations and the context in which we find ourselves. And I think for the longest time, I was so tuned into the dominant measure of value, and kind of worked with it unquestioningly. And it's only when you start to see the services that you develop producing suboptimal results that you start hopefully to question the criteria for value that you have been building against. And that sometimes, or at least one of the things I've learned is that in organizations, it's not always explicit, but there is always an implicit value criteria. And one of the things I've learned is to more consciously, intentionally tease that out, to ask the question, rather than just kind of absorb the value system of whatever organization I tend to find myself in, even when it makes me uncomfortable.
I think one of the things that I have learned in my path and in my specific path is the fact to be a little bit humble. In the sense that I don't work for a design agency, I work for a consultancy, business consultancy. So it's a very heterogeneous context. And I work every day with digital marketers, with tech people, with change management experts and so on. And we are declared always the ones that make the analysis, understand people, make the journeys and so on. And one of the things that I have learned is that when I enter to do these kind of things, but what I learned is that I needed to low down, these expectations that design would solve the world, and try to low down to understand all the stakeholders within and try to understand how can I connect them to try to produce an output, a final output. And this one, it wasn't easy because we were used to work only with designers, so we talk the same language. When you work with other kind of people, you don't speak the same language. And the part of the roles, this is my role, this is my other role, start fighting somehow. And at the end of the road, you don't get anything. So no one gets their ego or the situation a little bit down. So one of the things that I learned is I leave people speak, try to understand everything, and then try to feel where design in that moment is going to work to produce something. So this is one of the key things that I've learned during these years.
This might sound like a bit of an odd answer, but honestly, I've been coming out of a fog, and I feel like in the last few years, it feels like I am a recovering white person, is how I would describe it, because I spent so long trying desperately to be as English as possible, even though I'm Burmese. And in doing so, that sort of unlearning has actually led me to understand how much actually we center whiteness in the design profession as a whole. So if the big unlearning for me is about how to decenter whiteness and the sort of the addiction that I think that design has, would be the thing that I'm trying to work my way through, where we have default credibility and expertise to a very narrow band of white leaders who are themselves typically serving white clients, who are themselves typically serving and pursuing white consumers. That incredibly narrow band of human existence tends to be where the field tends to be led by. And I feel like I'm starting to realize I'm kind of over it, and recognizing that actually, similar to what Ade described, this implicit understanding of value is very present in the field as it is in our work. So I'm seeking out as much as I can a real differing set of perspectives on where do I look for leadership, who do I see as being canon, who do I look to for understanding and peer groups from. And even a call like this to be significantly richer than the ones I have typically seen. So for me, it's a lot of doing a lot of inward work right now, trying to work out how to undo some of those more trained narratives that I've been told to look to.
Okay, thanks for that, everyone. Okay, I think we kind of touched on power a little bit, so this kind of fits in quite nicely. So it would be great to get everyone's sort of initial thoughts, and then we can open it up to questions from the audience, because we are getting some really good questions in already. But yeah, so the question is, what is the role of a designer in redistributing power?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's important. If, let's say, this question is valid, which I definitely think it is, I would want to reference the fact that this question so rarely comes up because it would acknowledge the fact you'd have to know what the hell it was. Design and power go together so intrinsically that it seems to be something that's never discussed in school, but then secondarily never discussed in the workplace. But the reason why, for me, it became so exposed was that because we kept going into these social complex issues, the presence of power was evident in everything we did. So then when we show up drunk or essentially ignorant of our own power because we got given so much of it as a default, I think we've already heard a number of folks saying how we've been lauded as being the creative ones for so long. When we show up, we have an enormous amount of power to make enormous amounts of change, typically for people, in many cases, whose lived experience are radically different than I have had. And the question became, why do I get to control what this person's life and experience is going to now be just because I went to a certain school or have a certain amount of training or am handy with a Sharpie? Like, that seems kind of weird, actually, that might be what, that I have that much sort of influence. And I understand that there's a certain cachet and a certain sort of responsibility with doing good design, but typically the amount that would impact might be the sale of a new thing or the amount that something might have results in terms of a quarterly impact. So another way of describing why we should, what kind of role do we have is that if you consider, if you screw up in traditional commercial design, you might limit that screw up to some financial quarter or perhaps to a small, like you and your team. But if you screw up in the social sector work that we do, there's a lot of people that could be impacted by that seemingly minor mistake. So the responsibility that comes with understanding how to distribute power comes with, I think, recognizing what power we do really have, and really in many cases, how slow we've been to recognize the power we have. And that understanding comes with some responsibility, I think. I could talk about this all day, so I'm going to take a break here.
George, I'd love to build on that a little bit, and I think it also relates to your previous point about who has the design power in a space. And certainly, as a disabled woman, I share your anxiety, and I am over the design community's inability to diversify itself appropriately. But I think I would almost flip that question on its head, and because the thing that is exercising us in Scotland at the moment, and I don't just mean in Scottish government, and I'll explain why in a second, is less what's the role of the designer in redistributing power, but what is the role of power in redistributing design. So one of the things that we're trying to do in Scotland, having made huge commitments, particularly through the development of the Social Security Agency and all the benefits that go around that, having made really huge commitments to engaging people with lived experience in those design processes, and they have been deeply engaged in those from the get-go, for everything from design of the legislation to the customer charter, to the colour of the envelopes that we send out letters. People with lived experience have been deeply engaged in that. However, where we are really starting to look now is the terms within which we invite those people in, and I don't mean designers, because designers aren't the only people inviting those people in. So we have a big programme of work in Scotland just now to implement the findings of a thing called the Care Review, which was a root and branch review of the system of care for looked after children in Scotland. It was an independently conducted review. It came out with some really hard-hitting but incredibly powerful and insightful observations about what needs to change to improve the life experience of children and families who currently all too often end up in care. And we are absolutely committed to involving people with lived experiences. This is a system-wide, so it's every part of the public sector in Scotland, programme of redesign, to the extent that we're actually setting up a people's design school to train people with lived experience how to come into those rooms and be that person You know, on the social security program, for example, we do a lot of embedding of lived experience people with lived experience in those design moments. They help with co-design. They help with, we do collaborative sense making around research. We don't trust ourselves to interpret research. You know, we do all sorts of things, but we don't do enough to prepare those people to be in that room, and particularly to open that up to all sorts of different people. You know, it's all very well inviting a bunch of people to come and stand in a room and look at a wall full of post-it notes, but what if you're not literate? What if you can't stand? What if you can't read and see? And what if you're not comfortable being in a room? You know, all of these challenges around our own approach to our own design methods, frankly. So we're working really hard to redesign our design methods to be more inclusive and accessible. And we're launching a design school to train citizens in playing a more active, engaged, and sort of supportive and enabled role in co-design. And for me, that's the next wave, if you like, around a lot of the a lot of those kind of design challenges to do with big social complex problems.
For me, instead, when I see what is the role of the design and redistributing power, it's like, how can we as designer influence somehow the context that we're living or that we're working for? And I think what I have found is like the role of a designer to redistribute our own power of the design in this context is to be a bridge, okay? We need to be enablers or catalysts of different kind of conversations, understand different kind of language, and try to habilitate new discussions for people. The second one, to try to redistribute this power, is I think we need to learn a lot. We need to learn about new subjects, okay? We need to gather new knowledge to try to understand what are we talking for, what are we talking about, where are we talking, this kind of issue. So the part of the learning is one of our role for this redistribution of power. The other part is that we need to be negotiators and leaders for sure. I think the part of the soft skills that we mentioned also before is very important for us. So we were talking that we are in the big tables. Yeah, we're in the big tables, not because we are doing the services, experiences, or products in a very cutting edge way. It's because we are, or either bringing the collaboration mantra, but at the same time, we are talking and we're leading somehow the conversation when we are talking to a CEO or when we're talking to a head of marketing or whatever. Okay, so this is something very, very important. And the other part of the role that there was one of my reflection is the fact of we need to become also narrators somehow of complex languages, okay? Because when we're in different kind of contexts, we are gathering new knowledge, we're gathering new things, but at the same time, to achieve to good levels or try to make them understand, you cannot speak as you were speaking from a designer to a designer. You need to empathize with the context, or either you need to create more complex narrative to try to, send your message in a very efficient way. So this is my thought.
I think the answers have all been so good. This is always a problem with going last. And so one of the things I think to try and bring another angle to it, I think at least part of the role of designers, although again, this isn't limited to designers, is the work of creative imagination. One of the things that comes up so often, and I think it's in working in tech, it's impossible to escape this, is to build an ill thought out service or product, and then wringing one's hands afterwards going, who could have foreseen this? And the answer everyone else gives is everyone saw this coming. And I think that's really a failure of imagination. Before it's a failure of empathy, I think it's a failure of imagination. So when you're sitting in a room, and again, it ties back to the things we've already talked about, who sets the agenda? Very often, designers are not setting the agenda. But I think what can be done, and that's not, that's true of many disciplines in an organization, right? The hierarchy of organizations in general works to use inertia to kind of carry on doing what it's always done. And the values of an organization are set very early. But what creative imagination allows is a forum for challenging some of those things, even making our values explicit in a setting, or beginning to paint pictures that allow people in power to imagine themselves in those scenarios is really powerful. Dave Chappelle does a really good joke. Well, it's funny, haha, and then funny, when he talks about the experience of African Americans in terms of police brutality. And he kind of cracks a joke and he kind of goes, you know, I'm not saying white friends didn't believe me, but I am saying it took the cover of, it took this showing up in Times Magazine to go, oh my goodness, this is a real problem. Or having people say things about their experience with institutions of power, because this is the very first time they've encountered that, and then suddenly becoming advocates for change. Now, you could argue, you know, experience is the best teacher, but it's definitely, it's not an easily scalable one. And I think this is the power of imagination. This is the power of creative imagination. So when I think of service designers that I have found most effective with regards to making the wider group think about issues of power, it's been the ability to paint a picture beyond the narrow metrics we're using for measuring our product. It's, you know, beyond our product, our service, beyond what the policy has explicitly stated. And very often I think finding one's voice is part of the challenge. And it's really boring, but to me, it's a matter of bravery. It is uncomfortable. It's uncomfortable being the one in the room kind of going, well, let's try and broaden the scope, especially if you're working in an organization that has a really rigid devotion to the application of agile methodology, where any attempt to broaden the scope is frowned upon. But these are the things that I think designers are actually best equipped to do. It's painting that picture. So yeah, just another perspective on how I think this redistribution challenge can work.
Thanks, everyone. This like 5 thoughts being shared. I know I'm just conscious of time. We've got time for one question. I'm going to point it to Kat. Can you share a bit more about the Trained Citizenship School? And also a question from Suzanne. She's really interested in how you're redesigning your design processes to make them more inclusive. Could you share a bit more about that?
Sure. So the People's Design School is an idea that's been knocking around in Scotland for quite a while. We've been on a bit of a journey across the public sector and government and the third sector, for that matter, to try and overcome the problem of organisational-led design. You know, we design organisational bits of services. We don't design services around people's lives and people and their needs. And so that attempt to open that process up and to more deeply engage people with lived experience in the design process. I mean, I think it goes back to something that Adi just said. If you simplistically ask somebody with lived experience to come into a room, tell their story, so that you as power, which is designers and others on the other side of the table, can have your little moment of poverty porn, or can sort of feel like you're being very empathic because you're listening, and then you dismiss those people and you decide what to make of what you've heard, and you decide what to do with that. You are no more likely to arrive at an effective solution to a complex challenge than anyone else. If we are going to ask people with lived experience to come into those rooms and play those roles, what we want to do is help them understand what's going on there. So pass on some of those core design skills. I mean, for me, if you strip design right down, I mean, there are craft skills that we've already referenced, but if you take, the philosophical foundations of design, we live in societies that have forgotten, or in fact, even worse, cannot admit that human beings are really crap at solving problems. For good reasons. In our ancient history, it was important that you didn't spend too long contemplating whether or not that lion was coming to eat you. The important thing was you went, oh, problem, lion coming, run. We struggle with that. We live in a world that is obsessed with being right and correct and clever. and finds accepting that human beings are really very limited, and it's only through the painful process of working together. And again, I think, Adi, some lovely points you made in there around the ability to go beyond, to permission yourself to go beyond what's around you and what's obvious. And my personal journey has been really learning how simple some of the ideas that design gives you, how some of the most simple ideas of design are the ones we actually need to focus on, because human beings are pretty stupid. We all are, we're not that clever. But we are absolutely vested, especially in Western countries, in the idea that we are. And so we struggle to let go of that. So the People's Design School is being set up to, in the first instance, we're working around the review of the care system in Scotland for children and families. So we're focusing it on that. We'll be helping people understand what a public service is, how government works, how services are designed. And then we'll be helping them learn some of those core skills around how you sit with a problem and take some time to understand that, design is the art of understanding a problem and finding a solution in an imperfect world. All of those collaboration and compromise and imagination skills that good designers have, not all designers. So that's what we're going to be doing with that. It'll be launching early next year, and we're still in the process of setting it up just now. And then the intention is to try and expand that and make that, we live in a world beset by such terrifying problems, and I'm of the generation that gifted the world one of them, the climate emergency. I look at my kids, our current ways of working together to solve problems are not fit for solving those kinds of problems. And so, getting people engaged with those design skills much more widely. It's my ambition that every single citizen in Scotland participates in designing public services at some point in their lives, and that they do that having been trained and empowered with knowledge and skill to do that. And that, I think, is one of the ways that we are going to get into a kind of world that is much more likely to be able to solve those really big, those big deep challenges. And that is a huge journey. It's a huge journey for government. It's a huge journey for politicians. It will require massive change in how we think about how we do things as a country. But equally, it's difficult to see a way forward right now that doesn't involve that kind of level of rethinking. And I'm very lucky to work in a country, in a place, at a time when it's possible to even contemplate doing this, let alone doing it. Are we going to engage with only the most engaged citizens? Absolutely not, and that is why we're redesigning our methods and trying to understand what does it take to bring people who are really uncomfortable in power, who would never do something like this. So a couple of simple things, actually paying people to do the training, actually supporting them with useful things like additional kinds of support they might need to be part of that, looking at what kinds of access to resources they would need in order to get involved in that, and really pushing to get past all of those barriers, because that was one of the worries I have had about the journey we've been on in Scottish Government, is that it's still quite difficult to engage the people who live in the most multiply disadvantaged communities, or the most distant from power communities.
Okay, thank you so much for that, Kat. I think I can speak for everyone. We're really, really interested, and we can't wait to see how this all turns out. So yeah, I'm gonna sort of pass it over to Amog. If you can introduce yourself first, and we'll take it over. Yeah, you can take it over from there. Over to you.
Thanks, Service Lab, for having me. This is such a rich conversation. So I just graduated and got my master's in service design. And now I'm a service designer at Arrival. It's a company making electric vehicles. And I think we've done a really interesting job right now of sort of sculpting this narrative of service design, and also kind of breaking down these pain points that we're observing. So I guess there's a perfect dovetail into the next question, which is looking ahead. I'd really love to hear your perspectives on what service designers should be. And yeah, what do you guys think?
So this is shameless because of the industry I work in, but I definitely want to see service designers engaging with data and machine learning in a far more conscious way. So at the moment, I think very often when I speak to designers, their focus tends to be on the primary purpose of their service or their product. Increasingly, every service, more and more products are going to be data engines. So whether you like it or not, your product, your service, the system you're engaging in will become a generator of data, and that data will be used for something. Now, already, if we look at the very young machine learning industry, what we're already seeing is that there is an uncritical use of that data. This data that's being generated by different services, biases within data sets aren't being considered. And it's partly because service designers do not think of their products, their services, the systems they work on as generators of data. So there's that component. But the second component also is the design of the machine learning enabled applications. And there's a way we can design these things so that there is transparency. There is an understanding of power. There is an understanding of who gets discriminated against, who isn't represented in the data, who's overrepresented in the data. But that only comes when service designers begin to engage with it, and engage with it in a really robust manner. Too often when I speak on panels or I give talks, there's still a real sort of either a fear that, this is an area I don't know enough about and therefore I have no business there. And yet, this is at a time when the impact of algorithms, of programmatic decision-making is becoming more and more apparent, even as its use is more and more hidden and embedded in services. So I think for service designers, we are well past the point when there needs to be serious engagement with that. And again, I'd love to see this work of creative imagination begin to bubble up in terms of how service designers think about the use of machine learning, and then whether that's embedded in the services they're building, or whether it's using the data that their services are generating.
I would like to jump on that, because I think in our research we have identified 5 kind of topics service designers or designers should deep dive on. And the one is that we need to, gather for sure, as Ade mentioned, a tech literacy, let's say, or a data literacy to try to understand or what you're building in the terms of experience, in that sense of what kind of data you need to gather to produce, I don't know, a hyper-personalization experience or whatever, but at the same time, how you can give back all this part of transparency and privacy that you need to know. Also linked to that is the fact that we are creating also products that are, modifying a little bit the behaviors of people. So you're making the Instagram of the situation, and you're making people being a little bit addictive to all these kind of products, all these kind of new things that you're doing. So as the role of the designer, what is in the terms when you are delivering this kind of products? But to talk about the subjects, we identified five different subjects. One of the first one is that we're saying that we're becoming more strategic and that we're talking to the big tables again. So to do that, it's not only, it's necessary to deep dive a little bit more about the business. We need to try to, work hand in hand with business people. We need to understand their language, and we need to study to understand what these mean and how design can, interact in a healthy way with business. The other thing that we observe is that we humans are evolving. Okay, we have been evolving all the time. Okay, but right now we are evolving very, very in a very rapid way, in an unexpected way, let's say. So we think that the part of the behavioral part, it's going to become fundamental, because all the things that we're producing, such as technological products or whatever, are changing the way that we are expecting things or the needs that we are creating. And I think it's not only based on the fact that we need to gather the pain points and the needs of these customers. I think I think we need to understand the patterns that the people are generating. So probably the link of a specialization more, a little bit more linked to psychology. I see that within design as well. The third aspect is about technology, as I mentioned, and we have talked here before, is the fact that technology is not something that you put in a journey, has a touch point or something. It's fluid, it's like water right now. And to do that, you really need to understand how these mechanisms or patterns of artificial intelligence work, to try to understand how you can, deliver something that is end to end, and it's like transparent for people. So I think in this sense, designers need to have also a technological literacy or specialize in this. And the fourth point is related to the anthropology. I don't know how to pronounce that in English, but it's about the anthropocentric, because I think it's more important right now that we're talking about a human-centered, okay? But once we are designing about a human-centered, we need to understand how all the things that we are designing is also linked to the system itself. So we're talking about more than human here. So what if we design tomorrow a service that is instead for a human is for a robot, or is for animals, or even though that the things that you are designing in a specific context is how it's impacted the rest of the ecosystem that you're living in, so animals or the other vivid things that the planet is undertaking. So I think what I see is like, it's necessary for us not to be just generalistic and be like, being like in a zero ground. I think it's necessary that we start studying to be either holistic in the behavioral theme or a technological theme, but also the crafter who is going to build something. So I think it's quite important for us to be aware that we need to continue learning, that the fact that we are doing what we're doing, it's not enough anymore, and the learning needs to happen quick, and it needs to lead us with the things that we want to do as designers as well. So this is what I think.
Yeah, no, I think that's really interesting, especially in terms of the pace. You keep going back to pace, and that makes me think a lot about how much pressure there is on pace. One thing Kat mentioned, she said a service designer doesn't design a service. What would your response to this question be?
It's very, very interesting listening to you, and I'm sure it reflects my age more than anything else. So if I think back to the very first service I ever designed, it was in around 1992, and I was not a designer. I was actually, my job title was Director of Operations for a UNHCR mission, emergency relief mission during the Balkans War. I didn't know what I was doing was designing a service. I probably learned more about service design and about services during that experience than I've ever learned at any other point in my career. And I guess one of the things that worries me, I'm in my 50s, so I grew up in an era where, the enormous pressure to specialize that I see operating on the generations that came after me, didn't really exist. It was perfectly acceptable to have what I've had, which is an extremely diverse career, wandering in and out of all sorts of jobs and roles and titles. And, and I have never let a job title stop me applying for a job or thinking about my ability to do something. And I think one of the things I worry a bit about is the limited range of life experiences that so many people get sort of, stuck on a career path and forced down. And I don't think that is healthy for human beings. I really don't. And most of the fantastic designers, I mean, when I was working around, the IT industry, for example, the design end of the IT industry in the 90s, I met some of the people who built the internet. I met some of the people who designed the first Apple products. They were all older. They had all arrived into those professions from all sorts of other professions. Very few of them had been on a single career path. And they moved in and out of those roles as well quite freely. And I think there's something about being aware of that and the danger of being on that single track. And I think Addie's point around data literacy, that plays into that. I mean, for me, the ability to be a little bit of a dilettante, to try out lots of things, to not be afraid is so important. And I would add to data literacy, the thing that data literacy without a thorough understanding of epistemology is dangerous. And I think if there was one thing I would say for a service designer, it would be less what you need to evolve into, but more what you need to make sure you have, which is you understand how knowledge is made, and you have a rich and challenged view of that. Because the danger of sort of magical thinking, belief in data, for example, is magnified now by our data industries and the speed at which we generate and misuse data.
I might be able to speak a little just back to this question on the slide here about how thinking about the role of it in the future. I have been noticing that perhaps as the field of design has matured over so many years, in the last 20 especially, that we are reaching almost like peak craft. I think we are getting to a point whereby we are really good on that bit. And also multiplied alongside it is the propensity for so many schools and so many practitioners of this field. We must be at that point now where we're good. And I wonder if perhaps we've been missing a component around understanding the judgment of design and around the ability for us to be able to wonder when and how do we deploy both the field and armies of designers at our disposal. And there are some on this call who perhaps have more control over that than others. But the idea that we have groups of designers in great quantity to be set on things might wonder the question of like, well, when and how do we do that? And why are we doing that? And especially, why are we doing that now? There are quite a number of cases where we get asked to work on projects that are complex in nature and social, of course. But in doing so, we might sometimes pause to say, why are you talking to us? Why wasn't this same thing that everyone has seen around the world, some issue around systemic racism, why have you noticed it now? Or rather, how did this pierce the insulation that was around you and now break through? Was it not apparent to you before, or did it just not matter? Because I can't tell which one it is. And therefore, trying to goose out, when you're asking us, is there a risk that we're being used as cover to help shield you not knowing this before? So the judgment around whether or not we get involved in projects tends to be a thing that I see us not talking a lot about. And frankly, we don't have a lot of training in, because if anything, when there are questions to be tackled or problems in front of us, we almost can't help ourselves. We want to like Post-it note the shit out of this problem. It's like, can you give me a second? Just take a second, pause, and just work out, why are we being asked to do this? And in some cases, it is simply, the answer is, well, because we're going to make more money. Fine. But there are also situations where in doing this work, you are going to make things worse. We're going to multiply and increase the inequity that was already there. And because we called it human-centered or use whatever new term, we will pretend that we're making it better. We have added something to our portfolios and we've moved on to the next project. That's a lot of wasted time and trust, and a lot of that social capital goes down the drain. And I do wonder if perhaps the judgment of our craft could get more practice, but I do wonder, when are we going to get to practice that if everyone's obsessed with us practicing our craft only? So that to me is sort of where I think I'd like to see us evolve this practice. You know, can we have judgment and craft be done hand in hand?
I think to add to that, I think there is something that is quite important, and that I think in my personal experience that I have been also discovering within the research is the fact that we entered in a loop where we just went up or down or whatever. We just went straight to a north, and we just run, and we started doing practitioner, orchestrating projects instead of services, doing a lot of things. And right now, I think one of my personal reflections is try to understand how we can try to understand what was the purpose of the why we became designers, and try to ask ourselves right now why we are designers, and try to reconnect to that purpose. Or try to understand what is your new purpose in this new context where you're not the same designer that you dreamed of, because you're becoming what the context is limiting you a little bit to become of, so within the government or within consultancies or whatever. So the thing is also try to, we need to mediate with many things, but I think it's also useful to try to mediate to what's inside us as people, as humans, as designers, and try to reconnect it to go further and try to, search your path for the next thing.
That's a powerful way to sort of, I guess, wrap up one of the big questions to ask if you're thinking about judgment and sort of sense of purpose. It's really interesting. I'm going to pass it on now to Charlie.
Thanks, everyone. Some really raw and hard-hitting questions. We're asking our own practice there. So to round us up with the last topic, we'd like everyone to have a bit of a think about, what do you think the future of the service design practice looks like? Or maybe more importantly, what should it look like?
I'd love to start by just mentioning how much our studio has been learning from these adjacent disciplines that are equally obsessed with humans and behavior as designers. And I think that we would take a lot from learning from disciplines like social work and organizing and anthropology even, to better understand how do those fields have a handle on how they approach data and research, but also how they approach ethics. And I think what's surprising is how much design has found itself in a place where it impacts tons of people and their behaviors, and has not done an awfully good job of checking with their peers. So how did we end up here? Yet somehow, because we're super cool, we tend not to do that pausing. So I'd love to see, in many ways, like an opening of the gate, because I think there's an enormous amount of gatekeeping that happens in design currently. I've recognized that gatekeeping is helpful for there to be some sort of standardization, but I also recognize that an awful lot of gatekeeping is a form of a delayed trauma response, is how I would describe it. What I mean is that there are times when you have been ridiculed and punished to have to become a designer on that path. And therefore, when you see other people coming up, you feel as though there's a pressure to equally make it hard for someone else to go through the same pathway. If you don't, you might actually recognize perhaps the hazing period that I went through was meaningless bullshit. That can be really hard to reconcile. So there's a pressure sometimes to make sure that people go through the same hardship you went through in order to call yourself a designer. I would love to see an end to that, because there's such an innate human intrinsic quality to design around creating things. And this overt professionalism that we have not only has allowed for a lot of gatekeeping, it has propped up a lot of billing rates. So I'd love for there to be a reduction in the gatekeeping that happens, and just a more general acceptance of can we not all do this? I think there's a lot more people who can influence the future of this field who don't identify as designers, more so than the folks who do. Now I'm just ranting.
Echo. No, I think that's a great rant, George, and I just wanted to say I totally agree with everything you just said, and actually, for me, I think there's a sort of professional immaturity in service design in particular, and design in general, I think, but around our ability to absorb and engage with critical voices and big challenges, and I think there's something around how we get much more comfortable with that we really need to embrace. If you look at most professions, if you look at the history, the anthropology of professions, they all go through their kind of phases like we have, and the dark night of the soul comes at some point, and then you come out the other side much more, much more robustly able to engage in critical thinking about what you do. And I think, you're absolutely right, George, particularly in some of the areas that around government, public service, social good. The impacts of what we do and the dreadful consequences of getting it wrong are so huge that we can't carry on being as uncritical. And I really do hope that our community learns to absorb, and engage with critical thinking a lot more.
I'm gonna, I think, take a more tactical slant to this question. I think one of the ways that it would be great to see practice evolve is in moving away from a focus or a desire or objective to abstract away the messiness within service delivery. And actually, I should put this another way. So making services or making people's navigation through systems simple I think is an objective that hides a multitude of sins. I think actually, if we start to think about services themselves, the delivery of services as human-centered, we could see a world where we begin to intentionally surface the work of the people doing the work of delivering services. And I'm thinking about this more and more as I see the impact of COVID-19 and how it has exposed the lie that, you know, these services are elegant and beautiful and just magically happen. And as we begin to expose that, you begin to see, again, going back to some of the points that George has raised and discussion we've had so far about the distribution of power, especially of workers within these services that we design. That there is very often a power class imbalance between people who design services and people who deliver them. And I'm not quite sure where the idea came from that abstracting away the labor that goes into delivering services is desirable or something good, or somehow make services simpler to navigate. You know, this mantra of, you know, users don't want to see the messiness. They want to move through seamlessly. Where that objective came from, I'm not entirely certain, but we do see the impact of it, whether it's in terms of the denigration of the labor, definitely in power in labor relations, but also from an efficacy standpoint, what happens when you pretend there aren't real human beings behind these services? There is an efficacy problem as well. But for me, the biggest thing has been the impact on labor relations and the disempowerment of many of the people, usually the working classes, who deliver these services because we pretend they don't exist.
That's hot fire. That was amazing. We could end right there. That was so good.
There's been some fantastic chats also happening. We've got a couple of minutes if anyone wants to ask any questions. And then we'll be moving on to getting some feedback from all of you about what you'd like to see from the Service Lab community going forward. All right, it doesn't look like we've got any other kind of questions coming up. But I thought it might be good for us just to do a quick kind of wrap up. We've had so many rich kind of conversations coming up. We've heard about how, as a service line practice, we should be getting more involved in data and machine learning. We've been speaking about how much of a privileged position we hold as service designers and as designers in general, and how much that we should be thinking a bit more about what that means for us and how we should be kind of pushing service design further towards inclusion, diversity, sustainability, opening the gate for kind of other practices, other people, and also really pushing kind of imagination. I think we've also spoken quite a bit about not pigeonholing ourselves as well to what we might see as the real realms of service design, actually making sure we're pushing ourselves forward and just really kind of solving problems for people. Okay, I want to also just do a massive shout out for such a fantastic panel. Just big cheers all round. Thank you.